hard truths about China.
Did Australia underestimate its rise?
I think the world is caught up now.
They're very willing to exercise military and economic threats.
If it's in China's interest to do something, they will do it.
China has illegitimately taken control.
The Chinese government should be totally ashamed.
What's the goal of this?
The key thing that they're always worried about is being invaded. Why do you think they built the Great Wall?
If the US goes in, do we have to?
America loses wars. It's in Australia's interest to avoid a showdown.
How do you get things back on track?
Stand up for ourselves.
Do you believe that war is coming?
That is a risk.
What do you think President Xi's grand plan is?
Live indefinitely and run China indefinitely.
China's rise on the world stage has been nothing short of extraordinary. It's even been said that this is China's century. But with an increasingly authoritarian regime, China's relationship with the rest of the world is in uncharted territory. There's real concern about its ambitious economic expansion, and its growing military capabilities now reaches further than ever before.
China in the 1920s, a troubled land with a fabled history, once the most advanced civilization on Earth. This is the ancient greatness that Mao Zedong sets out to reclaim.
In 1945, mainland China was led by Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalist government.
In 1945, Japan surrenders. China has won the war.
And control of Taiwan went back to China.
But China is a ravaged land as Mao resumes his guerrilla warfare. Famine is widespread, people eat grass.
Chairman Mao and his communist forces fought savagely to overthrow the nationalists.
The fighting goes on for 4 years, until, in Mao's words, the cities of China fall like ripe fruit.
May 27, 1949. Down Shanghai's princely avenues rolls the victorious red tide. Red Star triumphant, hoisted over the world's most ancient nation. Silently, the crowds observe their newest conquerors.
Chiang Kai-shek and members of his government retreated to Taiwan, along with 2 million refugees.
Where Chiang Kai-shek with American arms has re-equipped an army 600,000 strong and dreams reconquest.
Chiang Kai-shek lost the Chinese Civil War and he decamped to Taiwan. From 1949 onwards, the British recognised Communist China, even though the Americans didn't.
Mao Zedong and his trusted Chief of Staff, Zhou Enlai, have made Communist China an emerging superpower by brutal force and rigid discipline. On Formosa, renamed Taiwan, nationalist China is ready, says Madame Chiang Kai-shek, to invade the mainland.
It thus strikes us as strange to be asked, as we are so often asked, do you expect to return to mainland China?
Despite threats and warnings, Mao never attacks the nationalists on Taiwan.
76 years later, little has changed. Taiwan still claims to be the legitimate government of the Republic of China, and Communist China still claims sovereignty over Taiwan. But now, President Xi wants an end to the status quo, and he's set a deadline. Minister, nice to meet you. Can you give us an idea of what it's like to represent the Taiwanese government and, in doing so, representing the Taiwanese people in the face of such Chinese aggression at the moment? Can you give us a sense of what that is like?
Well, thank you very much.
To be Taiwan's foreign minister is probably the most difficult diplomatic job on the face of the planet, because the Chinese government has always tried to make our diplomatic life very difficult.
Taiwan is an island, just 160 kilometres off the coast of mainland China. It's half the size of Tasmania, but it's home to 25 million people, and it's thriving. From humble fabric making to leading the world in advanced manufacturing. But this proud democracy is under a very real threat from communist China. Tensions have never been greater.
Is there a feeling of inevitability that President Xi will take Taiwan in the same way that he reclaimed Hong Kong?
We try not to let that happen. And the situation in Hong Kong and the situation in Taiwan are very different. Hong Kong was under China's jurisdiction, but Taiwan is not under China's jurisdiction, not even for one day. And we have our own central government, we have our own military, we are able to defend ourselves, and therefore what's happening in Hong Kong will not happen in Taiwan.
With the largest military force in the world, the People's Republic of China is running a constant campaign of intimidation and aggression against Taiwan.
For example, the Chinese government has conducted direct military threat against Taiwan, and the Chinese government is trying to prevent us from participating in international organizations or international activities. The Chinese government has been preventing us from having more substantial relations with other countries. So this is making our life very difficult here in Taiwan.
In the last 12 months, the People's Liberation Army have made over 400 illegal flights into Taiwan's air zone. And on the ground, the Chinese are using cyber attacks and disinformation campaigns to spread oppression and communist ideology amongst the Taiwanese people.
In China's mind, Taiwan has always been a part of China and should be returned to China. They've shown that they're very willing to exercise military and economic threats to try to bring Taiwan to heel. But of course, it's done the opposite. Taiwan has very much moved away from China. Taiwanese people feel Taiwanese, they don't feel Chinese, and only a small fraction of the Taiwanese public actually want to be unified with China. It's less than 1 in 10.
Taiwan is ready for China to make a move. But Taiwan will never be a match for the sheer size and strength of the People's Liberation Army.
Minister, can you defend yourself on your own?
We will absolutely defend ourselves. And that is the national determination. The people here will have the will and the determination to defend ourselves. After all, this is our territory, this is our sovereignty, and this is our democratic way of life.
I think it's important that the rest of the world makes it crystal clear to Beijing that there will be very serious consequences indeed were there to be any move on Taiwan.
We face a reality where the world must acknowledge that the Chinese Communist Party is a rogue regime, that is a regime that should not ever be considered to be a good actor in the international community, and it is a regime intent on global domination.
Due to its fraught history with mainland China, Taiwan's status has always been complicated. It has no formal relations with key democracies. So Taiwan has established unofficial relations with fellow democracies around the world, pictured here in yellow, such as India, Australia, and the US, to name a few. It's a unique situation, but it's key to Taiwan's independence.
If China did go in, so to speak, and try and take Taiwan, would the US go to war with China?
It would kind of depend. If Taiwan had been provocative. That might evoke a different response from the United States. But if 23.5 million democratically inclined people are attacked wantonly in military force, I think there would be, and I certainly hope there would be, a military response by the United States and others.
Do you think they will take Taiwan by force?
I think that's a real possibility, and I do believe they're getting closer to that reality.
Jack Keane is a retired four-star general and global security expert. He's provided strategic advice to Taiwan.
I don't see him doing what would be a classic all-out invasion with an amphibious assault. That would almost guarantee the United States and others to get into that conflict. Another scenario is a very massive but sustained and quick air and missile attack to include special operation forces with the express purpose of killing and taking down the National Command Authority and the legislature. In other words, kill as many people in the government and the leaders as possible, which would force a capitulation by the people.
That all sounds fairly ominous for the people of Taiwan then.
Yeah, very much so. They're very, very concerned about the increasing level of intimidation and coercion that they're under by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, it was always significant, but now it's exponentially greater than anything that we've ever seen before.
It's so great that the threat extends well beyond Taiwan. It's a threat to other democratic nations around the world.
Well, it's very important for China to understand that the West, that the United States and Australia and other countries believe very clearly that Taiwan, if it's to be reunited with China, has to be done peacefully. And the will of the Taiwanese people has to be that they wish to reunite with China.
Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. Let me repeat that. Taiwan is not a vital Australian interest. And under ANZUS commits us to consult in the event of an attack on US forces, but not an attack by US forces, which means Australia should not be drawn, in my view, into a military engagement over Taiwan, US-sponsored or otherwise.
For China, it's firmly a domestic issue. And nothing frustrates the authoritarian regime more than a challenge to their rule.
Another of the grievances is that many countries, including ours, are spearheading a crusade on Chinese affairs, particularly in Taiwan. What would be your reaction to that?
Well, Taiwan is a democracy, a pluralist democracy of 25 million people. And why shouldn't a democracy of 25 million people in the South Pacific be concerned about the fate of a democracy of 25 million people off the coast of China?
It's not just democracy that's at stake in Taiwan. Also at stake is the future of the world's most important microchip industry.
It absolutely is the most complex technology in the world. It's unbelievable, even if you work in the space. If you take a human hair and dice it up into 10,000 pieces, take one of those pieces, and that's the scale of these transistors, these little pieces of the circuits in a microchip. That's how small they are, and we have control over that in these big foundries. We have control over that and have the ability to build up these complex circuits.
Microchips are everywhere and in everything, from the household fridge to cars, phones, and computers. Taiwan produces over 80% of all global supply.
What happens if Taiwan can no longer supply chips to the rest of the world?
There'd be chaos. I mean, we've seen that through COVID, that the supply chain was disrupted a little bit, and chaos ensued. But we also need to address the fact that it's really high risk having sort of almost a sole provider of these high-end chips.
At the same time, as it persists with its aggressive territorial claims over Taiwan, China, even more aggressively, claims the South China Sea. It's a crucial international shipping route, abundant with natural resources, and China has illegitimately taken control.
Station calling U.S. military aircraft. Please identify yourself.
This is Chinese Navy. Please go away quickly in order to avoid long judgment.
They've gone too far now, haven't they, in the South China Sea? There's not a great deal more we and other nations can do. I mean, they're not going to pack things up and move away.
Well, I think there are important things that we can do, particularly in conjunction with our allies. When you have a British carrier group coming through the South China Sea, Australia has been publicly announced will join in that. We'll send a frigate to accompany that. That's exactly what we should do, because that demonstrates that these are international waters, that they are subject to freedom of navigation, and we should do that when it's appropriate in our national interest and consistent with our capability.
For a military airplane, you are approaching my military security air. Please go away quickly in order to run judgment.
I am a United States military aircraft conducting lawful military activities outside national airspace. I am operating with due regard as required under international law.
The illegal militarization extends throughout the South China Sea. There are more than 25 Chinese outposts all through here. But there are three that are most significant. The first, Woody Island. Once a patch of sand, it's now a fortified base that involves thousands of Chinese personnel. There are also missile silos, radar, and an extended runway that's long enough for heavy bomber aircraft.
It's all about trying to get the region used to the idea of a large-scale military presence of assertive Chinese aircraft and ships, and really saying to everyone now, you just live with that, because this is how we're now running the region.
There's also Mischief Reef. In 2016, it was deemed part of the Philippines economic zone. China has reclaimed over 1,400 acres of land and built a military base and deep water harbour for Navy ships.
This is highly dangerous territory, and it's a game of chicken, which I believe the Chinese have been copying the Russians on, and learning that the more aggressive and audacious your behaviour, the more you can get away with.
But China's most advanced, most powerful base sits more than 1,000 kilometres from mainland China, Fiery Cross Reef. From little more than a rocky outcrop, in under a year, it was transformed into an island fortress. It's now home to missile launchers, hardened shelters, and hangars for dozens of warplanes.
So I think that both the United States and Australia underestimated how important the South China Sea was. And when Xi Jinping was going through his island building, the Obama administration of the day took the view that this was not worth a fight with Beijing over some rocks and shoals, as they were described. In fact, what happened was that China built military bases to give it the capacity to actually control the air and sea space around the South China Sea. And it's not a small piece of geography. It's about 80% the size of the Mediterranean. And it just so happens that it's an area of geography through which a vast quantity of Australian trade flows, and all Japanese oil and petrol flows. And so therefore this is a critical bit of strategic geography, which we rather dumbly allowed China to establish control over, and is now, frankly, China's to control.
U.S. military aircraft, please stay away this area and leave immediately. Your action is unfriendly and dangerous. Your actions are dangerous.
China's illegitimate occupation of the South China Sea has caused tremendous geopolitical tension. Countries around the world are forming new relations and deepening existing ones. How to curb China is now a priority.
Since you left office, China's really expanded, shall we say, its militarisation of the South China Sea. Have you been surprised by that pace and aggression?
That is very disturbing, and it's all the more reason why we should reinforce our security alliance with the United States. It's why we should talk collaboratively with our democratic allies in the region, such as Japan and the United States and India.
There's the Quad. Australia, the US, Japan and India, all wanting to push back against China and all intent on maritime order and a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Each year, the Quad's separate forces come together to sharpen joint force operations.
Can we allow China's aggression and its expansion in the South China Sea to continue?
Well, what he's suggesting Australia does about China saying we're going to do what we've been doing, that is build artificial structures. Australia rejects the notion of the 9 dashed lines representing a border. I mean, if I had been asked about it as Foreign Minister, I would have said Australia doesn't remotely recognise that. No country does. Australia rejects the notion of militarisation of these artificial structures, and we certainly don't accept that there's a zone around an artificial structure that China builds.
China now has plenty of firepower to throw around. Their navy is the world's biggest, with over 350 battleships, and many more are on the way. While the US has 290. China now has the most missiles, and the strike range is a huge international concern. Not to mention the most combat aircraft and more tanks than any other nation. But it's the boots on the ground where there's the biggest difference. China has well over 2 million active military personnel. The US, 1.3 million. And Australia, we have around 60,000 in our defence forces. The race to counter China's military might is now on.
Quantity does have a quality all of its own. And the Chinese have considerably more offensive missiles than we have in the region. They have considerably more air power in the region, and they have considerably more maritime ships in the region. And they have deployed hypersonic missiles, and we're still developing and testing our hypersonic missiles. So we are, for the first time in a long time, we have an overmatch problem that we're dealing with Chinese.
China's looming threat has led to the United States realigning and increasing its forces on the Indo-Pacific. Nowhere in the world right now has a greater military build-up.
So are you expecting war in our region?
If you listen to the rhetoric of President or to other officials from China, they seem to be on a path of inevitability to take back Taiwan, in their own words. If that was the case, then it would be a question as to what the Americans did, whether they entered into a conflict with the Chinese, and then we would have to make a decision off the back of that. But are we seeking anything but peace in our region? Of course not. In fact, every effort, every decision that we're making at the moment is toward maintaining that peace and making sure that we have whatever support we can for our neighbours in the region to keep that stability and peace going.
There are undoubtedly tensions between China and Australia.
Did we underestimate China's rise?
Xi Jinping is possibly the most powerful general since Chairman Mao.
It has always been born through violence, wanting to achieve power.
China thinks Australia is a relatively insignificant country that got too big for its boots.
The seeds of Australia's relationship with China were planted 50 years ago in very unconventional circumstances. Then opposition leader Gough Whitlam effectively invited himself and a small delegation to communist China, which at that time was poor and isolated from the rest of the world. It was purely speculative, and it wasn't long until he received a reply.
Whitlam was welcomed by the Chinese, but they were wary. He was the first Western politician to visit communist China.
What he demonstrated was a better thinking about the future on relations with China than the then government. But of course, the real breakthrough in relations with China was Richard Nixon's visit to China a year later.
I want to express my very deep appreciation to all of you who have come here to send us off on this historic mission. We, of course, are under no illusions that 20 years of hostility between the People's Republic of China and the United States of America are going to be swept away by 1 week of talks.
President Richard Nixon was on a mission. He wanted a start to peaceful relations with Beijing and stability in Asia.
And let the great Chinese people and the great American people be worthy of the hopes and ideals of the world for peace and justice and progress for all.
For the first time in history, the door to communist China was opened to the West.
We have been here a week. This was the week that changed the world.
Did we underestimate China's rise?
I think if I look back over, say, the last 6 years of my involvement in the National Security Committee, I don't think it was envisaged then that China would continue to grow, to be as aggressive toward neighbours in the region. The confrontational approach is quite remarkable. And what we see in countries in our nearest neighbours, the economic coercion, the threats, as I say, is quite staggering. And I think it was underestimated for a period of time, but I think the world has caught up now.
For decades, the world watched on as China grew bigger and stronger and became more relaxed. But in 2012, Xi Jinping took over and quickly stamped his dominance over the Communist Party and the people of China.
Well, Xi Jinping is possibly the most powerful General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party since Chairman Mao. And I think he wants to be written into history as the man that brought China back to global greatness.
Under President Xi, China is now more defensive and paranoid than ever.
You only have to look at historical Chinese movies, and everyone is trying to screw everyone, basically. So it has always been born through violence, wanting to achieve power and stay in power.
Greg Rudd is former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd's brother. He knows China well, having spent 5 years in Beijing as a political and business consultant.
So in terms of, what in the Labor Party some people call rat-free, in terms of that, the Chinese are just thousands of years ahead of how that works and how that is executed. But it's the old story, you don't keep on poking the bear.
When the bear is poked, the wolf warrior comes to the rescue. He's one man who overcomes many. But now, the wolf warrior isn't just an action movie character. It's a symbol of China's confrontational attitude to diplomacy. And highly ranked Chinese officials are leading the way. Like Foreign Ministry spokesman Lijian Zhao, who posted a disturbing fake image to social media. Australia's reply was instant, so was the outrage.
It is deeply offensive. It is utterly outrageous. And it cannot be justified on any basis whatsoever. The Chinese government should be totally ashamed of this post.
It set a new benchmark in foreign relations with China.
There are undoubtedly tensions that exist between China and Australia, but this is not how you deal with them.
What did you make of that tweet at the time?
Well, I think it's an overt demonstration of the propaganda and the disinformation that's taking place. It was factually incorrect. It was offensive, to say the least. But it was designed to be provocative, to be a tool against Australia's international reputation, and it does damage, there's no question.
What does China think of Australia?
China thinks Australia is a relatively small and relatively insignificant country that got too big for its boots. And I think it is a source of immense frustration that parts of China's economy rely on Australia's exports.
They seem to spend a lot of time talking about us, though.
That's absolutely right. You know, given we're such a small country, it's interesting how much bandwidth we've been occupying, and I'm sure that is also a source of frustration.
So are we a rock in their shoe? Is that what we are?
Maybe a pebble.
A pebble.
I think so, but you know, it's important to remember here in Australia, we feel very singled out and we feel like it's just us that has this quite fractious relationship with China. But China is currently engaged in political disputes with 20 or 30 countries in our region.
Outside our region, it's another story. There's hardly a country in the world not influenced by China in some way. And this could prove to be its most powerful tool. The Belt and Road Initiative, the largest infrastructure and trading network the world has ever seen. And it's President Xi's pet project.
What's the goal of this? What is it, and why is it so important to China's plan?
The key thing that they always worried about is being invaded. Why do you think they built the Great Wall? So their concern is that they have to feed all of those people, and they have to have enough resources, metals, minerals, agriculture coming into China to sustain them. They don't want to be the subject of trade boycotts or starved out, to use the old term.
Since its launch in 2013, China has signed up over 130 countries to Belt and Road agreements. So far, it's cost them over $1 trillion. The deals are economically binding for decades.
It's effectively about spreading the economic influence of China by connecting more markets to mainland China and by allowing it to help control its own supply chains.
Projects around the world include high-speed rail networks and gas pipelines, but the vast majority of BRI investment goes into the energy sector. China has invested in over 200 coal-fired power plants.
I don't have a problem with foreign investment. I don't have a problem with free trade. I think where Belt and Road may be of concern is if it's being used to sort of snap up critical national infrastructure assets that are then used to illegitimately coerce or put pressure on another sovereign nation. I think that is not in our kind of current system of global order, and that's not playing by the rules of the game.
In Sri Lanka, China helped finance a $1.3 billion shipping facility. Under its 99-year lease, Hambantota Port is now controlled by a Chinese state-owned company.
Their initiative, essentially behind this, is to, okay, let's develop these deep water ports, give loans, that no one can pay back, and then take over ownership of the port, make sure where you build the port, you can drop some battleships and aircraft carriers if need be, so that you protect your maritime trade routes. So that's essentially what the game plan is. Yeah.
Targeting poor countries.
Well, their view is that the West has been doing that forever.
Should Western countries be concerned about the BRI?
Well, only simply because we're being outmanoeuvred, yeah. So, yeah.
Is that what's going on?
Yeah.
It's like chess, they're a few steps ahead.
Indeed.
Daniel Andrews today met with the Chinese ambassador. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
In 2018, Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews went to Beijing.
making Victoria the first and only Australian state to open trade and investment opportunities for China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative.
It's great for jobs, great for investment, and just the latest sign that the Victoria-China relationship is Australia's strongest.
But Daniel Andrews went too far.
If Mr Morrison wants me to apologise for making sure the Victorian businesses get the best opportunities out of Australia's best relationship with China, the Victoria-China partnership, well, I'm not going to be doing that.
But after 3 years, the federal government stepped in.
The Foreign Relations Act that our government put in place was designed to protect our national interests by ensuring that there were no other agreements entered into by any other level of government that would conflict with Australia's national interest.
Were you always suspicious of the BRI?
Look, I'm always suspicious of debt trap diplomacy, and it's certainly become apparent in more recent times that that is a risk with the so-called Belt and Road Initiative. The main thing is that state governments shouldn't be running an independent foreign policy, and now they're not.
The Victorian government was pulled into line, but in the Northern Territory, a separate deal was done with a Chinese state-owned company.
Under the 99-year deal, Chinese company Landbridge will run the commercial port.
It was good business for the local government, but would prove to be highly controversial. Darwin is home to an Australian naval base and thousands of rotating US Marines.
I think the most telling year in Australia-China relations was modern relations was 2015. That was the year when the Northern Territory government leased the Port of Darwin to a Chinese company for 99 years. That came as a big shock. Even more shocking that our defence establishment at the time didn't seem to be concerned about that.
Do you think any Chinese company that does business in Australia can keep the CCP at arm's length?
No.
Impossible.
No, well, in fact, under their 1993 company law, they have to have a CCP unit and have to make provision for them. They have to do that. It's the law of their land.
So every Chinese company here should be treated with suspicion?
I think we should remember that the Chinese Communist Party has units in Chinese companies.
Was it a mistake to lease out the Port of Darwin?
The Port of Darwin, as ASIO and our Defence Forces said at the time, is a wharf. As the head of one of our security agencies said, someone in the fish and chip shop would have got more information about who was coming and going than someone in the management of Landbridge.
But tensions with China have now reached new heights, and the Darwin port lease is officially under review. So what should happen now to the Port of Darwin? Should the lease be ripped up?
Yes, I think the government needs to take the port back under Australian control and then possibly lease it again, but this time, if it's to a foreign company, let's make sure it's from a country that we can trust. Don't be surprised if, in the not too distant future, you see more US Marines coming to operate in the north of Australia. And if they're going to do that, they will need access to a port facility, and they won't want to be making use of a Chinese-controlled port.
China's threat to national and regional security has led to powerful new alliances.
The first major initiative of AUKUS will be to deliver a nuclear-powered submarine fleet for Australia.
In the most significant defence announcement in a generation, Australia, the UK and the US have come together to form AUKUS. It's a security pact determined to contain China's ambitions. Given that we have basically ripped up the old arrangement for conventional subs and are going towards nuclear subs, they're not going to be available until closer to 2040. Critics have argued that addresses a long-term threat, but there is a current threat, as you know, that is right now. So are we exposed in the now, in the short and medium term?
No, we're not. And I'll make 2 points. I mean, one is that we have a Collins class that's just about to enter into a life of type extension. They are the best in class, and they're with regional superiority at the moment. All I can say to you, Peter, is that the US and the UK are pulling out every stop to facilitate the early arrival, the early construction of those vessels, and that will give us a capability, I think, far ahead of what some of the critics are estimating at the moment. The second point is we're acquiring significant capabilities in space, in cyber, in guided weapons, in munitions, hypersonics. All of that is part of the AUKUS agreement. So that all goes to paint, I think, a picture that there is no capability gap and that we have, many layers of protection and support, as you would expect.
The AUKUS announcement was not taken well in Beijing.
他们将核出口作为地缘政治博弈的工具，采取双重标准，这是极其不负责任的行径。
China bit back, as you would expect. It said that the move from us gravely undermines regional peace and stability. What was your reaction to their reaction?
I mean, the reality is that China has a defence budget about 10 times larger than that of Australia. Every 18 months, China, on a tonnage base, is building more naval capability than the whole of the British Navy. They've got 20 bases across South China Sea. They are involved in economic coercion, in grey zone activities, cyber, foreign interference, etc., on an industrial scale.
8 submarines against China, when we get the submarines in 20 years' time, it'll be like throwing a handful of toothpicks at a mountain. A handful of toothpicks at a mountain. These Virginia-class submarines were designed in the 1990s. The time we have half a dozen of them, it'll be 2045 or 50. They'll be 50 or 60 years old. In other words, our new submarines will be old tech. It'd be like buying an old 747.
What would war in the region look like?
Well, war would be devastating. A conventional war, bad enough by anyone's measure, and we know that a nuclear war would be devastating. And you're talking about powers here with nuclear capability. So that needs to be avoided at all costs.
It would be an almighty conflict, and China would have to know that.
This is the big difference, Peter. I think if you look at China, who are their friends? Well, for convenience, Russia. Are they a decades-long friend? Have they fought in wars together? Of course not. On the other side of the ledger, you've got the rest of the world. And who would come to the aid of the United States? Well, NATO would. And we know that our Five Eyes partners would. We know that India is very concerned about their own situation. And we know that Japan sees this is an existential threat to them as well. So I think there is every reason for China to hesitate, but in the rhetoric at the moment, we're seeing a very clear message that their intention is to do something in relation to Taiwan. When that is, we don't know, but they've been very clear in their statements.
This is a regime that doesn't respect Western values, it doesn't respect human life, and it is a party that is trampling on the rights of its own people. The pandemic and the actions that they took there, I think, were a flare, a signal to the world of the regime that sits in Beijing today and its intentions for how it will treat its own people and the rest of us as well.
If it's in China's interest to do something, they will do it.
So it's absolutely critical we demonstrate this will not work against Australia.
They want to be what they once were. They want to be the dominant nation.
Who takes over when he goes? He's created a single point of failure.
Where China wants to go in the medium to long-term future within the world is that they want to be what they once were. They want to be the dominant nation, the dominant style of leadership. So we just have to understand that and work with it, not bang like that, because banging like that is like, if that's China, we are an invisible molecule banging up against them. And we here in Australia are not going to win that battle by ourselves, yeah, for sure.
What do you think President Xi's grand plan is?
Oh, his grand plan is probably to sort of live indefinitely and run China indefinitely.
President for life.
Yes, yeah, he's president for life. That's unlikely to be the case, but it's equally the reality we have to deal with now.
伟大光荣英雄的中国人民，万岁！
Being the leader of an economic superpower gives you bragging rights. One of them is the rags to riches story for more than half of China's population.
No one foresaw the economic rise of China. In the early 90s, everyone was tipping that this would come undone before the 90s were out. What China's doing is adding 850 million more people to middle-class status between 2012 and 2030. And despite coronavirus, despite the West fighting back, they're on track to do it.
Hello?
Peter!
Monica, how are you?
Monica too, really nice to meet you.
You're the property queen.
Oh, yes.
Of course.
Humble.
Yeah.
One member of that growing middle class can now be found here in Sydney.
Australian, very friendly people. You know, if you go to Chinatown, people say, oh my God, everybody can use chopsticks.
Yeah.
Oh.
Her name is Monica Tu. She's a real estate agent and she's doing rather well.
The total business turnover is over $200-something million every year.
More than 200 million.
More than 200 million.
Every year.
Otherwise, they cannot survive. Yeah, every year. Peter, welcome to the Grand Sky penthouse.
Very nice.
The most expensive penthouse so far on the northern beaches.
Wow.
$18.5 million.
18.5.
Yeah.
Before the pandemic, China had become Australia's largest source of international visitors.
So if you show me a checkbook, I will sell it to you.
They came in greater numbers and spent more money than any other country.
But how much does Australia stand to benefit from this rising middle class?
We definitely benefit from the rise of the middle class.
So it should be embraced.
We should embrace. I'm a businesswoman, so we're talking about business relationships. Now, why we want to destroy the business relationships, which the countries actually benefit. Your countries benefit, everybody's benefit, right? We're talking about job opportunities, right? We're talking about, ample opportunities. Why want to destroy that? I just couldn't understand.
And 850 million people we're talking about here.
850 million people.
That's a lot of people.
They're not all bad people. They're all good people. I think among the Australian people and Chinese people, I think we're beautiful people.
Are we in danger at all of missing out on the economic benefits of China's booming middle class?
China does everything with strategic intent. China is a controlled society and a controlled economy in a way that our society and our economy never have been and never will be.
Do you feel like Chinese investors get picked on?
Sometimes I think so. But again, I'm a Chinese, maybe I'm a little bit more sensitive about how they talk about China. Sometimes I think so.
And why do you think that is?
I don't know. That's a really good question. Why did maybe they're Chinese? Yeah. So if you look at what's happening out there, right? So Chinese, of course, is an emerging country, and the country is getting economically stronger. And if you get stronger, you become a target, right? So I become a target because I'm a good agent. Sometimes, that's okay.
Monica now calls Australia home. Hers is a life of freedom and independence. For that growing middle class back in China, they are basic human rights that will one day haunt President Xi.
I don't think that there's a proper understanding of the governance challenge the country will face as more and more people are born into middle-class affluence. Those people are going to want a say in running their lives. I think human nature suggests that if you transition from poverty to comfort and affluence in your lifetime. You're pretty grateful for that, and you'll perhaps put up with being pushed around by an authoritarian government. But if you are born into relative middle-class comfort, you'll take the freedom that goes with that for granted.
Beijing is the seat of power for the world's most populous country. It's a one-party, one-ruler city. Here, President Xi answers to no one.
Because he's succeeded in centralising power so successfully, he's created a single point of failure within the Chinese political system, just as Putin has in Russia. There's no redundancy. Who takes over when he goes? Who fills the vacuum? What comes next? And that's the fragility that any state that's structured around one personality or one ruling family or one dynasty is susceptible to that fragility, because they don't have the strength and the resilience of nations that are governed by systems and institutions, because they're governed by a person is mortal, a person eventually dies. What takes its place?
If this trade war has exposed anything, has it exposed that we are too reliant on China?
It's important that we try to diversify our exports. It's important that we try to ensure that our supply chains are secure. And if there has been one interesting and hopefully beneficial consequence of the pandemic, it has been a bit of a wake-up call in terms of our over-reliance on any one supplier.
And so where do you think we should be pivoting?
Look, I've often said that the answer to almost every question about China is India.
India is now potentially the next big solution for Australia, but at the end of the day, just like everyone's told at business school, you know, don't buy one stock, spread your risks. What Australia needs to do is spread its economic risk by having more relationships, including with old countries like the United Kingdom and places like that. You know, we just have to sort of give up on the thought that dependence on an authoritarian regime is a smart idea.
So is there any one leader who has questions to answer here, or is a whole bunch of them?
I think the Australian leadership, frankly, from John Howard on, has questions to answer about how we allowed ourselves so naively to become dependent on one country. I think every Australian Prime Minister, you know, right up to Scott Morrison, has some questions to answer on that account.
The Chinese are in their rude phase, you know, they're in the adolescent phase of their diplomacy. They've got testosterone running everywhere, you know, but we have to deal with them because their power will be so profoundly big in this part of the world.
It's not just trade and economics that are at stake here. There's national pride.
You're the future. You and some others are the future of the party moving forward, of the government. How do you deal with this? How do you get things back on track?
We have to be very assertive and very determined in advocating for our national interests and our values. And the worst thing we could do is send the message that the bullying tactics that have been used against us are successful. Because if we did that, we'd guarantee we'd get a whole lot more of it. If we gave in to some of those 14 demands, then those demands would escalate, they wouldn't decrease.
You're bending to their will.
Exactly. We would send the message this is a good political strategy used against Australia, and probably would be putting a lot of other countries in danger too, because it would guarantee those tactics are used against other countries as well. So it's absolutely critical we demonstrate this will not work against Australia, and we will do everything we can to stand up for ourselves.